This is Kim with CSG Consulting. Thanks for joining me again this week. And I have Clifford back, and we are going to be talking about the nuances of shipping and shipping on time and what that means to the customer. This week, we're going to talk about the importance of ship date, arrival date, and promise date, because that's what really matters to the customer. And a lot of companies out there are really just focusing on ship date. So Clifford and I are going to walk you through while these three data points are the most important and you need to measure them to have a successful customer experience. So welcome back, Clifford.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. So let's start by defining what do each one of these things mean. So let's start with ship date, because I've worked with a lot of companies where there's some variation in what they think ship date means. And I think you and I have a very firm opinion on this. So why don't you tell me what you think ship date means?
Yeah, so ship date is the moment that you tender the package to the carrier. That is ship date.
Okay.
And so some companies think it's when the order drops into the FC or when they have potentially packed it out and put it somewhere prior to a carrier pickup. But it's actually when the carrier takes possession of the
Yep.
cargo.
Agreed. And so let's talk a little bit about that, because way back in the day when you and I started in this business, the carriers were really FedEx, DHL, UPS, USPS. Those were kind of the big four carriers. And the minute that package was tendered to them, it got scanned onto the truck and you had a pickup date was available to the customer. So that last mile has really evolved in the last 10 years or so. And we have we have a process called injection. Right. So now that the e-tailer can actually drive the boxes to an injection point with a carrier, with the post office, it's a BMC, a bulk mail center. UPS, it's an induction center. And that has created some discrepancies with ship date along the way, because now the question is, has it really been tendered to the carrier, and when does that happen? So that's when you'll see like a lag in getting a ship date from 24 to 48 hours, even though the package has left the facility. So what do you think about that? And do you think companies are handling that correctly today?
Well, I think that the real crux of the matter is that ship date is an internal facing metric that really only the company should care about. Really only the customer, when they're placing an order, doesn't really care about your internal processes. What they care about is, when will the package be on my doorstep? And so to me, that when we're defining all of these pieces and components that make up from when order drops to when package is on your doorstep, the only thing that matters is whether you define them one way or other is less critical than understanding what it takes to actually get that product to the customer. And at Amazon, in the early days, we started with arrival date, but that became quickly replaced with promise date, which you mentioned earlier. And the reason that we replaced it with promise date is because we felt that it was so critical that when we make a commitment to a customer about when you will have it in your hands, that is a promise that we want to keep.
Okay, great. So just to recap, ship date is when it leaves the facility and is onboarded with a carrier. It is received by the carrier. Whether that carrier is an internal carrier or an external carrier, it really doesn't matter as far as the customer experience goes. It's really an FC metric that's used to measure the efficiency of an FC, and is not a customer facing message. And servicing that up to a customer really doesn't have value. Telling a customer that your package is shipped is interesting, but not necessarily valuable from the fulfillment experience.
Yeah, and I can't really tell you how many times I turn, abandon cart or abandon a page because the only information I can get is usually ships within 1 to 2 days.
Right.
Which really isn't relevant to me, because then your next set of selections is, choose your shipping speed standard or whatever, right? 3 to 5 days and stuff. I don't want to have to do math. I want to know when I'm going to have it in my hands,
Yep.
So from an internal perspective, you absolutely need to understand all of the mechanics of when, from this stage, from order drop to pick, from pick to pack, from pack to tender, from tender to injection, from injection to transportation, from transportation to last mile. Like, that measurement process is super critical. And if you're not measuring all of those things, then there's no way you can give a promise date. And I suspect that that complexity is why most companies fall back on usually ships within, because they know what their own DC processes look like, and have a pretty good handle on that, but they're not doing everything to understand the whole package. How does the whole thing fit together?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I see, I continue to see a lot of big retailers out there who are pillars in the market. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between arrival date and promise date, because that's very nuanced. And as you know, there are maybe a handful of companies out there who are really using promise date the way that you talked about it, like calculating a promise date all the way up to the product page is a big commitment for a company. So let's
Mhm.
talk about the difference of arrival date and promise date and why you think promise date is more important.
Yeah, so arrival date would be a swag,
Hmm.
right? Arrival date is, well, depending on when your FC cutoff is for pack out, depending on when your carrier pickups are, depending on, on average, a standard ship takes N number of days, but that doesn't account for, say, South Dakota, where it could be N plus two. Basically, an arrival date is a swag number, and it is just our best guess at when you will get it, versus a promise date, which is a calculated, knowable thing based on actual carrier performance, actual FC performance, actual last mile performance. So the difference is pretty critical, because if I tell you the arrival date is Tuesday and it comes Thursday, well, that's because I used a bunch of averages.
Hmm.
Versus if I tell you I promise that you're going to get it on a certain day, I'm using something that is more accurate, more real, based on the real activity that's happening in your fulfillment network. And if you think about what's happening right now with all of the lock-in that's occurring, and all the people that are looking for online alternatives because they can't get out, again, I have been online looking at various things to get shipped to me, but if they can't make a firm commitment and I don't know when I'm going to get it, I'm less likely to make the purchase.
Yep.
And that's just the way it happens. This is a huge and critical component to abandonment, that a lot of e-commerce companies, they intrinsically understand it, but they're not doing anything about
Yeah, I agree. And it's because of the complexity. Even big companies are working with a single centrally located fulfillment center and warehouse. Some of them are into 2 to 3 warehouses. They've got a bi-coastal and a central. And one of the things that starts to fall through the cracks when companies start working in distributed order management, and we'll get to omni-channel in a minute because that's a whole other thing, start to get into distributed order management across time zones, shipping zones, carrier performance changes depending on where they are in the country. And so it becomes a much more complex calculation, and companies don't want to put that work in. But as you said, that is the thing that converts customers, because they have confidence that I am going to get this no matter what you do. I'm going to get this by Tuesday, and that's your promise to me. And so one of the things we're seeing right now with Amazon, right, is that Amazon is the leader in the promise date, right? They started it, they perfected it over time. But in our current environment with the virus and all the quarantines and the shelters in place, Amazon is shifting that message a little bit right now. So they're kind of leaning back into that, okay, we're still showing you a promise, but we're telling you that it's going to take probably a month for it to get to you.
it.
So what are your thoughts on that? And we know why Amazon's doing it, but how do you think they're managing it in the back end?
Well, Amazon systems are the most complex in the world, and they can adapt, and literally by a size color variation of a SKU, reach into the network and understand and calculate at any moment in time uh, where it is vis-a-vis where you are, and look at all of the different carrier tables and all that. And so what they can do with that information is layer over the top of that rule sets that say, these SKUs are no longer qualifying for this kind of fulfillment service level,
Mm-hmm.
and so they can segregate them. And that's something certainly that's extremely unique to Amazon because of who they are. But it doesn't mean that companies shouldn't be thinking about how that sort of thought process would go into the prioritization of your fulfillment. And and it could be as simple as, a lot of companies today are saying they will give you kind of an order by, and it leaves our warehouse today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a little more helpful than usually ships in 1 to 2 days. But you could even bifurcate your inventory into these leave today, these don't leave today, things like that.
Yep.
In order to at least increase the likelihood that the customer is going to have a better understanding and experience with the final mile of when they're going to receive that.
Yeah. And you touched on a really interesting topic there. And we're really kind of getting into the weeds, which is great. But there are some companies, Amazon being the one that comes to mind the most, that do manage shipping by SKU level, right? And all the way down to color and size. So you think about Amazon and their big FCs and then their forward deploy nodes and their consolidation centers and the complexity and the fulfillment that happens today. So way back, when you and I started I started in 2006, you were there when I already started. Amazon had a handful of big FCs. That's how they were operating. And then they moved into the injection and forward deploy nodes and moving inventory out and out and out and closer to the customer before it actually got in a box, because that's what makes it most efficient. But that is what gives the customer the confidence.
And, the interesting thing about that as well is, Amazon has an extremely distributed network.
Yep.
In order to manage inventory, keep it inventory close to the customer. Most companies at most have maybe presence in 2, maybe 3. They might have a west, an east, and a central location. A lot of companies live on a central location. But assuming you had like 2 locations, again, most companies are thinking about how you put the inventory in the east in order to serve customers in the east. You put the inventory in the west or central to serve west of the Mississippi. But Amazon would think about that totally differently. And sure, that might be an 80-20 rule, but they also are trying to figure out like, what's the best way to, again, coming back to promise, how do I best meet that promise? If I'm on the East Coast and I order something, it might actually get to me quicker if I shoot that order to the central location and expedite it. And all of those things happen in the background at Amazon in order to hit like a 99.97, at least back in the 2000s. That's what we targeted for promise. And if you didn't, if you were part of the team that was not contributing meaningfully to 0.97, then you had a talking to. But that's kind of the, again, it's taking some of these more primitive concepts, and you don't have to go all the way to where Amazon is.
Right.
If you think about how promise then ripples back through how you would fulfill, even in a 2-node network, you might change some of the thinking about how that works.
Yeah. So one thing I want to touch on real quick, because you said it, and I have said it a couple hundred times in my career, and I often get that kind of screwy look, like they don't really do that. Amazon does measure to the second decimal, 0.97. Like when Amazon talks about money, about metrics, we're not going to 99%. We're going to 99.97, and the 0.97 matters. And that is what Amazon is measuring on a daily and weekly basis, not the 99, the 0.97.
Yeah, for sure. Right. And at the scale that Amazon operates, that's like hypercritical. So larger companies, the Targets of the world, the Walmarts of the world, should definitely be operating at 2 decimal points.
Yep.
That may be overkill for companies that are smaller and nichier, but the point being is you need enough precision to understand whether you're satisfying your customers or not.
Yeah.
And you can work that out internally, but do you even have a metric that says, I said you were going to get it on Tuesday and I measured it, and is it 80%? Is it 90%? Like, even if you just start there, that's a huge leap forward.
Yeah, yeah, massive leap forward. Before we start digging right into arrival date, I want to talk a little bit about the distributed fulfillment and having multiple FCs, because there's a couple of things that Amazon does that I don't necessarily see other e-commerce and retail companies do. And it's not only about getting the inventory closest to the customer to reduce those shipping costs, it's also about getting the highest number of items per package. So the goal is to get your order in as few packages as possible. And one of the things that needs to happen is not only do you have to have all this inventory close to the customer, you have to have the inventory that matters close to the customer. And an example I use frequently is storing UGG boots in your Miami FC in the winter is not necessarily a great thing to do. You need to have those in your Chicago FC where they're selling the most. So I have run into companies that store like their bikinis and bathing suits are in their northernmost FCs, and they're constantly shipping those down south, right? Because that's where the buyers are. So it's not about getting all of your inventory closest to the customer. It's about getting the inventory that matters to the customer closest to the customer, and getting the like items. So cell phone chargers and cell phones in the same FC. Have you seen companies struggle with that level of complexity as well?
Yeah, for sure. And, and there's a couple things to think about there. Certainly, a lot of companies that, especially that import directly,
Mm-hmm.
bring their like if you're an OEM and you're bringing in your product from China,
Yep.
you might home your fulfillment center in Los Angeles because that's the dock where your freight's coming in. And so sometimes the decision making is principally based on where are your vendors or where is your inbound inventory, and the cost structure that to bring it in becomes the overriding decision making point on where you home that, not necessarily these other components of transfers, long hauling, extra UPS costs to customers,
Yeah.
all those other things, right? And so, so for example, at Sims, we don't look at those costs. We look at where the landed costs are, and we make the decisions based on that. And I've been arguing that we should be moving to a central location, or like Denver would be good, or even Reno to
Yeah.
serve our customers. So that's kind of a big component of it. And then the other component really is what you were talking about, which is use the demand signals that you're ordering, of your orders to figure out. And this one's pretty straightforward, right? You simply look at where in geographies products are being ordered, and if you have a multi-node network, you can use that information to make some of these simple decisions. And it doesn't have to be 100%. Again, you
Yeah.
just got to get started somewhere by looking at that order data. And even though it seems really intuitive what you said about the UGG example, some companies just Uggs come in from, they arrive on a Miami dock, so they stay in Miami, or
Yeah.
right, as opposed to being, take that extra step to transport them to, so that your fulfillment costs shrink, right? And
Yeah.
are you managing both sides of the equation?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, because the cost to move a 40-foot container out of LA to a, let's say, an FC in the middle of the country, let's say that cost, I don't know, $800 to $1,000 to truck that container. It's probably high, but we'll go with the high story.
Mhm.
And companies look at that and they go, wait a minute, we're not, why are we spending all this money to move it to the FC? It came in LA, like blah, blah, blah. We should have it in LA. But what they don't talk about is now we're getting into zone skipping, and we're getting into multiple packages per order. And the cost for those things fly under the radar a little bit, because let's say zone skipping is costing $2 to $3 a package, which is if you look at that as just bold face, right? You're like $700 versus $200. It makes no sense. We shouldn't spend the $700. We should keep it in LA. But it's $2 to $3 over and over and over and over and over again. So it's not only the cost to the network, it's also the customer experience, because the customer is going to get, it's going to have a longer shipping time. They're going to have less confidence it's going to get there on time, and they may have to wait longer to get it. And this is how, when I talk to people and they're like, how does Amazon do 2 day? How does Amazon do 1 day? It must cost them $10 to $15 a package in order for them to do that. It doesn't, because that piece of inventory was within 150 miles of you. And that's what's happening all over the country with Amazon today.